The hall was busy, full of people dressed in fine clothes, chatting quietly and moving around with plates and glasses in hand. It was one of those events where everyone seemed to know each other, laughing in small groups, showing off their best smiles. But in the corner of the room, near the stage, a young performer waited quietly. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes or expensive shoes. His hands were a little nervous, and his heart was beating fast. No one seemed to notice him. Most people had already decided he wasn't important. He had been asked to play music for the evening, but only as a small, polite addition to the background. Some of the guests, standing near the stage, looked at him and whispered to each other. "Just play a simple tune," one of them said with a smirk. "Nothing fancy. Just make it quiet so we can talk." The young performer nodded. He didn't complain, even though those words made him feel small. He had heard them many times before in different places, people telling him to keep his dreams small, people laughing at the idea that someone like him could make something special. But tonight, even though he felt a little afraid, he had something in him that refused to stay quiet. He looked at the instrument in front of him. It was old, worn from years of use, but it was perfect in its own way. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the cold metal under his fingertips. The sound that came out was soft, almost shy, but it carried a memory of every long night he had spent practicing alone. Every note reminded him of the times he had worked without anyone watching. When no one clapped or noticed, the people near him laughed quietly among themselves. Some thought it would be easy to ignore him. Some whispered that the evening would be better if he kept his playing simple and safe. They didn't know anything about what he had inside. They didn't know that behind his calm expression was years of patience, struggle, and quiet determination. He took a deep breath. He could feel the pressure building. The room was loud and filled with chatter. People were moving, talking, and not paying attention to him at all. He could almost hear the doubts in their eyes. They didn't think he could do anything worth noticing. For a moment, he thought about stopping, walking away, hiding in the crowd. But something inside him whispered, "Just play. Just let them hear you." He remembered the nights he had spent alone in a small room, practicing the same songs over and over. His fingers had grown strong and skilled from hours of repetition. He remembered the moments when he had wanted to give up, when he thought no one would ever care about his music. And he remembered the feeling when he finally played something that sounded just right, even if no one was there to hear it. That feeling gave him courage. He glanced around the hall. Everyone was busy with their conversations. They didn't even notice the way his hands hovered over the instrument. He smiled quietly to himself. "They don't know what's coming," he thought. He didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the noise of the room fade away. In his mind, he imagined the music, the tune that had been living in him for years. It was simple, yes, but it had a heart. Then he started to play. The first notes were soft, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't listening closely. They were gentle, almost like a whisper. At first, people barely noticed. A few glanced in his direction, then returned to their conversations. But even in those first moments, something began to happen. The music wasn't just filling the space, it was reaching into it. It touched the corners of the room, moving through the chatter and laughter like a quiet wind. For the young performer, it didn't matter that the audience wasn't ready. He played with all the honesty he could give. Every note carried a part of him, his struggles, his hopes, his dreams that had never been seen by anyone else. He didn't play to impress. He didn't play to get applause. He played because he had to. Because he had something inside that demanded to be heard, and slowly, very slowly, the room started to change. People began to notice the music, even if they didn't understand why. The conversations became softer. A hand stopped mid-gesture. A few heads turned toward the stage. Something about the sound made them pause. They weren't sure what it was yet, but they could feel it. The young performer didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could sense the shift in the room. The people who had laughed at him, who had told him to keep it simple, were starting to realize that this was not just simple. There was something alive in the sound he was making, something that could not be ignored. And in that moment, as the first tune floated through the hall, he felt a quiet confidence. He knew that no matter what anyone thought, he had started something that could not be taken back. Something real had begun, and the room would never feel quite the same again. The young performer had just begun when a subtle change began to ripple through the hall. At first, it was almost invisible. Some guests shifted in their seats. A few lowered their voices, and others turned their heads toward the stage with curiosity. Most of them still believed it was just a polite background performance. They didn't expect anything remarkable. But there was something in the way the music floated, delicate yet confident, that made it impossible to ignore completely. Some of the guests whispered quietly among themselves. "Is he really going to play all night?" One asked, a trace of amusement in their voice. Another shook their head and laughed softly. "It's just a simple tune. Nothing to worry about." Yet even as they spoke, their attention kept drifting back to the stage. The soft notes had begun to pull at their curiosity, even if they didn't want to admit it. The young performer, sensing the skepticism in the room, felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He had faced doubt before, in countless classrooms, on small stages, and even in quiet living rooms where no one had listened. But those experiences had taught him one thing: music didn't need approval to exist. It didn't need applause or praise. All it needed was honesty, and he had that in every note he played. He let his hands move more freely across the keys, feeling the rhythm flow naturally. The tune was still simple in structure, but each note carried intention. He remembered the nights he had spent alone, practicing the same passage until it felt like a part of him. The music he played now was a reflection of all those hours of effort, all those moments when he had struggled, when no one had seen him or believed in him. At the other side of the hall, a few guests who had been chatting paused mid-sentence. One of them, an older man with sharp eyes, tilted his head slightly as if trying to understand what had changed. There was a subtle weight in the notes, a depth that didn't belong in ordinary background music. Another guest, a woman with a glass of wine in hand, frowned slightly. Something in the tune tugged at a memory she couldn't name. It was haunting and beautiful, but she couldn't place why it felt so familiar. The young performer's breathing grew steadier. He had felt this before, the moment when people begin to notice without even knowing why. He didn't rush. He didn't add unnecessary flourishes. He simply let the music speak. And in that quiet space, as he played, the hall began to transform. The chatter that had filled every corner started to fade, replaced by something heavier, more present. Even the staff who had been bustling around the room sensed it. A young waiter paused mid-step, holding a tray of drinks, and tilted his head toward the stage. There was no showmanship, no dramatic gesture, just music that demanded attention through its honesty. A few seconds later, the same waiter found himself forgetting the orders he had been carrying. The sound had captured him entirely. Some guests who had been dismissive began to feel a strange unease. They had assumed the performer would be ordinary, and now, without warning, he had created a space where their assumptions no longer applied. The confidence in his playing was quiet but undeniable, and it seemed to grow with every passing note. The music wasn't just filling the air, it was reaching into the hearts of everyone in the room, stirring emotions they didn't expect to feel in such a formal setting. For the performer, there was no room for doubt now. His initial nervousness had faded, replaced by a calm focus. He remembered all the times he had been overlooked, all the nights he had practiced in silence, the moments when he had wondered if it was worth continuing. And now, for the first time in a long while, he realized that those moments had led him to this exact point. Each note he played was proof of every struggle he had endured. The people near the stage began to lean forward slightly. Some of the skeptics exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces. "It's different," one whispered. "I didn't expect this," another admitted under their breath. No one spoke loudly, no one applauded yet, but the energy in the room had shifted. Where there had been amusement and dismissal, there was now curiosity, and something deeper, anticipation. Even those who had been entirely focused on their own conversations found themselves caught off guard. A man standing near the back paused, a half-empty glass still in his hand. He could feel the music reaching past his thoughts, reaching somewhere inside him he had not realized existed. He frowned, confused by the emotions that were rising without warning. The performer didn't glance at him, didn't even acknowledge the audience directly. He simply let the music continue, letting it carry the weight of every unseen struggle and every hidden hope. A subtle silence began to settle over the hall. Not a complete silence, because the room was still full of people, still full of life, but a quiet respect had begun to form. The young performer could feel it. He could feel the room holding its breath, and in that moment something remarkable happened. People started to notice that the music was not background noise, it was a story. Each note told a piece of his life, each pause carried a memory, each soft chord spoke of hope, fear, and resilience. For some guests, the effect was immediate. A woman resting against a pillar felt a tear form in her eye. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the emotion she couldn't explain. A man sitting near the front, who had spent the evening speaking loudly and laughing with friends, found his hands still on the table, staring at the stage in disbelief. The music had captured their attention completely, and no one could look away. The young performer didn't play louder or faster. He didn't try to impress anyone with speed or skill. The beauty of the moment came from its simplicity. It was honest, raw, and full of feeling, and that honesty was contagious. It moved through the room like a wave, touching everyone differently but equally. People who had believed they were too busy to notice him now found themselves completely immersed. Even the guests who had been most skeptical began to feel the shift. They had expected something small, something easily ignored, and yet here they were, caught in the quiet power of a simple tune. They tried to rationalize it, telling themselves it was clever timing or coincidence, but deep down, they knew it was more than that. Something inside the young performer was shining through, and no one could turn away from it. In the middle of the hall, a group of older guests exchanged nervous glances. One of them whispered, almost in disbelief, I didn't expect this. Another shook their head. He's good, they admitted quietly. There was no envy in their voice, only surprise and admiration. Because the young performer had achieved something they hadn't expected, he had captured their attention fully. With nothing more than his music. As the minutes passed, the room became more attentive without anyone realizing it. Conversations had faded almost completely. Guests had stopped fidgeting, stopped checking their phones. All eyes slowly turned to the stage. Even those who had come for an evening of talking and socializing now found themselves suspended in the moment. The music had stopped being a background element. It had become the center of their attention. The young performer continued, feeling more confident with each passing note. The anxiety that had been there at the beginning of the evening had melted away, replaced by a quiet strength. He knew that what he was doing mattered not because of applause or recognition, but because it was real. For years, he had wondered if anyone would ever understand his music, if anyone would ever listen closely enough to hear it. And now, slowly, people were, even the staff who had been moving around the hall, delivering drinks and clearing tables, paused to listen. A few leaned against walls, almost afraid to move, as if moving would break the spell that had been cast. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with an energy that no one could explain. The music was more than sound, it had become a presence, a quiet force that held everyone in place, and through it all, the young performer remained focused, aware of nothing but the keys beneath his fingers and the sound that flowed from them. He didn't glance at the audience. He didn't seek approval or validation. All that mattered was the music itself, the story it carried, the emotions it awakened, and the attention it commanded. By the time the first section of the tune reached its natural pause, the room had completely shifted. People sat silently, unsure whether to speak or move. The skeptics had been silenced, and the curious had been drawn in completely. Even those who had been indifferent at the start of the evening now found themselves leaning forward. Waiting, listening, almost afraid to break the spell, the young performer lifted his hands, preparing for the next part of the tune. He felt the room's attention fully upon him, not in a way that demanded something from him, but in a way that simply acknowledged the honesty in his playing. And in that quiet, human-centered moment, he realized that something remarkable had begun. The music was no longer just his, it belonged to the room now. to every person who had stopped to truly listen. The young performer's fingers moved effortlessly over the keys, but now the tune began to change. It was no longer just gentle background music. The melody had grown richer, deeper, and more expressive. Every note carried feeling, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that quietly demanded respect. The hall, which had once been filled with laughter and conversation, now felt different. It was as if the music had stretched invisible threads across the room, holding everyone together in a single moment. People started to notice in a way that surprised them. At first, it was small gestures, a head turning, a hand stopping mid-gesture, a pause in conversation. Then, the realization began to sink in slowly. This was no ordinary performance. The performer's hands moved with a confidence that came not from a desire to impress, but from countless hours of practice, countless nights spent alone when no one had been there to watch. The music carried honesty, and people could feel it. An older man near the back, who had been chatting with colleagues moments before, froze in place. He had expected polite background music, the kind that allows people to talk and sip their drinks without notice. Instead, he found himself leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the young performer. The notes seemed to reach through the air directly to him, stirring emotions he had long ignored. Memories of childhood, of quiet afternoons spent listening to piano music in his home, flashed through his mind. He hadn't realized how much he had missed that kind of feeling. Even the people who had been skeptical from the beginning were now caught off guard. A woman near the front, who had whispered to her friends that it would be nothing special, now held her glass tightly in her hand, staring at the stage with wide eyes. The music was simple, yes, but it was alive. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it had weight, depth, and presence. Every note seemed deliberate, as if it had been chosen not just for sound, but for the story it told. The performer didn't rush. He didn't try to show off skill or speed. He let each note breathe, giving it space to resonate. The longer he played, the more people realized that the tune was not just music, it was a reflection of his life, of his struggles and his persistence. For some, that realization was overwhelming. They could feel his dedication, the countless hours of unseen effort, and the quiet hope that had carried him here. A young couple standing near the side of the hall found themselves holding hands without thinking. The music had softened the edges of the room, creating a space where people could feel something beyond polite conversation or casual observation. For a moment, they forgot the formal event, the fancy dresses and suits, even the pressure to maintain appearances. They were simply present, listening, feeling. The atmosphere began to change in subtle ways. The clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversations faded almost entirely. Staff members paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue serving, afraid of breaking the spell that had fallen over the room. Even those who were least inclined to be moved by music, those who had come simply to observe, network, or enjoy a quiet evening, found themselves unable to look away. It was not showmanship that held their attention. There were no dramatic gestures or flashy movements. The performer's eyes remained calm, focused only on the keys beneath his hands. But the music itself carried something undeniable. It spoke of resilience, of quiet strength, of someone who had worked in silence for years, preparing for a moment they hadn't yet realized would come. For some, the effect was immediate. A man leaning against a wall felt a lump rise in his throat. He tried to blink it away, tried to tell himself he was overreacting, but he could not. There was a sincerity in the notes, a sense of truth that could not be ignored. A woman near the back felt tears well up in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. But unable to stop listening, the young performer, though aware of the audience's reaction, did not let it distract him. He played not for approval or praise, but because the music needed to be heard. Every note was a small declaration of who he was and what he had endured. He thought of all the times he had been overlooked, the doors that had closed, the people who had doubted him. And now, in this single moment, he was sharing the essence of himself with a room full of strangers who were beginning to realize that they were witnessing something rare. Even the skeptics could no longer hide their surprise. A group of older men near the front, who had scoffed when the performer first began, now exchanged quiet glances. One of them whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't expect this at all." The others nodded, eyes fixed on the stage. There was a collective understanding forming. Unspoken but powerful, what they had dismissed as ordinary was, in fact, extraordinary. The music began to take on more emotion, each note carrying subtle shifts in tone. It was as if the performer was telling a story without words. Listeners felt it differently, each interpreting it through the lens of their own experiences. Some felt nostalgia for moments long past, others felt hope for the future, and many simply felt the beauty of something genuine unfolding before them. The silence in the room deepened. People stopped moving, stopped speaking, stopped even breathing loudly. It was not an uncomfortable silence, it was a silence full of attention, of focus, of awe. Every eye was on the stage. Every ear was tuned to the delicate, precise movements of the young performer's hands. And yet, despite the intensity of the attention, the performer remained calm, humble, and focused entirely on the music. It was at this point that the hall truly began to freeze. Not literally, of course, but emotionally. People who had come expecting a background tune were now completely absorbed. They were listening not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. The music had captured them fully, pulling them into a shared experience of wonder and recognition. For the performer, this was the most powerful moment. He could feel the shift in the room, the collective awareness that something extraordinary was happening. He did not play louder or faster. He simply allowed the music to flow naturally, allowing the notes to tell their story. And with each passing second, the hall became more alive, not in noise, but in the intensity of focused attention. Guests who had been talking quietly now whispered only to themselves. They did not interrupt the music. They did not fidget or glance around. Even those who had initially doubted him were leaning forward slightly, their eyes wide with a mix of surprise and admiration. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that a simple tune could hold such power. The young performer paused for a brief moment, letting the final note of the phrase linger in the air. The sound resonated, almost echoing in the room, and in that silence everyone felt the weight of what had just passed. For a second, no one moved. The audience was completely still, as if afraid to break the spell that had fallen over them. It was a remarkable shift. The room that had been full of casual chatter, laughter, and dismissive looks was now fully present. People's attention was unified, their focus drawn not by spectacle but by honesty and skill. They were experiencing something that went beyond music. It was a story, a moment, a connection to someone's life and effort, and they could not look away. And through it all, the performer remained calm, humble, and entirely absorbed in the music. He was not aware of the awe around him. He was aware only of the story he was telling through the keys, the emotion he was conveying, and the quiet triumph of finally being heard. By the time the first movement of the tune ended, the hall was no longer just a room full of people. It had become a space of shared wonder. Eyes were wide, breaths were held, and hearts were moved. The young performer had achieved something rare. He had taken a room of strangers, many of whom had doubted him, and made them feel, truly feel, through nothing more than the honesty of his music. And as he prepared to continue, there was a sense that the moment was larger than anyone in the room could fully comprehend. They had witnessed the beginning of something unforgettable, and even if they could not put it into words yet, they knew that their evening, their perception, and their hearts had already changed. The young performer continued to play, and now the music had grown into something even more powerful. It was no longer just a tune. It was a story in motion, a quiet storm that wrapped around everyone in the room. Every note carried feeling, every chord seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those listening. The hall, once filled with chatter and polite conversation, now seemed to exist in a different world. Time had slowed, and the music was the only thing that mattered. Guests who had been skeptical at the start now sat completely still, eyes glued to the stage. The older man near the back, who had initially shrugged off the performance, now leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as if he might fall over if he moved. He could feel the music pulling him into a place he hadn't expected, stirring memories and emotions he didn't realize were there. His eyes glistened slightly, but he didn't dare look around to see if anyone else noticed. The young performer didn't glance at the audience. He didn't need to. He was lost in the music, in the story each note was telling. His fingers danced over the keys with grace and precision, but it wasn't just skill, it was emotion, pure and unfiltered. He had poured years of practice, struggle, and quiet hope into every movement, and now it was being heard, fully and completely. By everyone in the room, a woman standing near the front felt tears rise in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed, but unable to stop herself from feeling the music in a way that words couldn't describe. She hadn't expected to be moved at an event like this, surrounded by strangers and formalities, yet here she was, completely captivated. She realized she had been holding on to stress and worries, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something light and alive inside her. Even the people who had been laughing and whispering at the beginning now sat quietly, unable to speak. One man, who had been joking about the performer's simple tune, pressed his hand to his chest, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. He had come to this event expecting only small talk and polite entertainment, but now he felt part of something far bigger. Something real. Something honest. The music grew stronger, but it was never overwhelming. It was controlled, deliberate, and full of meaning. Each note seemed to float in the air, linger for a moment, and then move on to the next, leaving a trace of emotion behind. It was as if the performer was speaking directly to the audience without words, telling them a story of perseverance, hope, and quiet triumph. And slowly, they began to understand, not through logic or explanation, but through feeling. The atmosphere in the hall shifted completely. The air felt heavier, charged with attention. Guests who had been fidgeting now sat still, their eyes fixed on the stage. Even the staff, who had been walking quickly from table to table, paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue with their work. The music had claimed the room entirely. It was no longer background noise, it was the heartbeat of the evening. And everyone could feel it. A young couple standing near the side held each other's hands tightly, both overwhelmed by the beauty of what they were witnessing. They hadn't spoken a word since the performer began, unable to break the spell. The music seemed to connect them in a way that went beyond sight or sound. It touched a place inside them they hadn't realized needed attention. They squeezed each other's hands, as if silently agreeing that they would never forget this moment. The performer, though completely absorbed in the music, could sense the reaction of the audience. He didn't need to see their faces to know that they were moved. The room had become silent in a way that was rare, almost sacred. Every person was present, fully aware of the notes, the pauses, and the emotion in the air. It was a shared experience, and yet deeply personal for each listener. The music grew more expressive, more confident. The performer allowed small crescendos and subtle changes in tempo to emerge naturally. He didn't overdo it, and yet the effect was powerful. The audience felt it, and they responded in kind, not through words, but through silence, through held breaths, through eyes wide with wonder. They were no longer observing. They were part of the music, caught up in its flow and its emotion. Even the skeptics could no longer hide their awe. The group of older men near the front, who had whispered doubts at the beginning, now looked at each other in silence. One of them finally spoke, almost in a whisper. I didn't expect this." His friend nodded, unable to find words. The simple tune they had dismissed had become something extraordinary, something that transcended polite entertainment. It had captured their attention completely. The performer moved seamlessly through the tune, shifting effortlessly from gentle, tender moments to passages full of intensity. It wasn't just sound, it was storytelling. Every pause, every touch of the keys conveyed more than technique. It conveyed life. It conveyed the long hours of practice, the setbacks, the quiet moments of doubt, and the persistent hope that had carried him here. And the audience could feel it. A woman resting against a pillar felt goosebumps rise across her arms. She tried to steady herself, but the music was too powerful to ignore. The room was alive with feeling, yet calm, as though every person present had entered a moment outside of time. It wasn't chaos or noise, it was quiet power. It was presence. It was awe. The music reached a particularly beautiful moment, a section that seemed to float above everything else. The performer's hands moved with gentle speed, each note precise, deliberate, and full of heart. The audience held its collective breath. Some leaned forward in their seats, some stood quietly at the back, but all were united in attention. The hall, once full of casual chatter and polite conversations, now held only one focus: the music and the emotion it carried. For the young performer, this was the peak. He could feel the connection, the invisible bond forming between him and the listeners. He wasn't playing for applause, recognition, or approval. He was playing because the music had to be heard, because it carried the story of his journey, and because he wanted to share it in the purest way possible. The notes were more than sound, they were truth. The silence that followed a long, lingering chord was deep and complete. The hall seemed to exhale collectively, as if releasing something they hadn't realized they were holding. Guests who had come for casual entertainment now felt the weight of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just music, they had been part of something rare, something genuine. Some people blinked, almost afraid to break the moment. The young couple at the side pressed their foreheads together, eyes closed, feeling the beauty of the music fill every corner of the room. The older man at the back rubbed his hand over his chest, overwhelmed by the emotional power of a simple tune. Even the skeptics were silent, caught in awe they could not deny. The performer slowed slightly, letting the final section of the tune breathe. Each note lingered in the air, delicate yet strong, like a whisper of hope. He didn't play loudly. He didn't need to. The emotion itself carried the room. Every listener felt it differently, yet everyone understood the truth in it. They were no longer strangers in a formal hall. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, something human and unforgettable. As the last note faded, a profound stillness filled the space. The audience remained quiet, unable to move, speak, or even breathe fully. It was not awkward silence. It was the awe of having experienced something rare. For a moment, the room felt suspended outside of time. And in that stillness, the performer knew something remarkable had happened. He had touched the hearts of everyone present, not with showmanship, but with honesty and courage. Finally, slowly, people began to react. It started quietly, a soft exhale, a gentle murmur. Then came the applause. Not polite clapping, but true, heartfelt appreciation. Guests stood from their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes, some smiling through disbelief. The room was alive with emotion, a shared recognition of the beauty they had just witnessed. The young performer stood, calm and composed, allowing the applause to wash over him. He didn't raise his hands dramatically, didn't seek attention. He simply nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that the music had done its work. The hall had been transformed, and in that transformation, he had shared the story of all his unseen hours, struggles, and hopes. For a moment, the audience seemed to understand something beyond music. They understood persistence, courage, and the power of honesty. They had come to a formal event expecting background entertainment, yet they had witnessed something that touched them deeply. And though the performer was quiet and humble, the impact of what he had created would stay with them long after the evening ended. The final notes of the music lingered in the air like a soft, warm echo. For a moment, the hall remained completely still. The audience, still seated and standing in awe, didn't know what to do. They had just experienced something rare, something they weren't expecting, something that went far beyond a simple tune. The young performer, calm and composed, let the last chord hang, allowing every vibration, every feeling, every emotion to settle in the hearts of those listening. No one moved at first. People blinked slowly, as if afraid that any sudden action might break the magic of the moment. Some guests pressed their hands to their chests, trying to catch their own rapid heartbeats. Others whispered quietly to themselves, not to each other, struggling to find words that could describe what they had just felt. It wasn't just music, it was a story, a journey, and a reminder of something important. Honesty and persistence matter, even when no one seems to notice. Then slowly, the applause began. It was soft at first, hesitant, almost as if people were testing the waters to see if it was okay to express what they were feeling. One by one, the claps grew louder, richer, and more genuine. This wasn't polite clapping, the kind reserved for formal occasions. It was heartfelt. It was admiration for someone who had given everything without asking for recognition. The audience was applauding not just the music, but the performer himself. And everything he represented. The young performer remained standing at the stage, quiet, humble, and still. He didn't raise his hands, he didn't smile widely, he didn't bow repeatedly. He simply allowed the applause to reach him, understanding that the music had spoken louder than words ever could. For him, the moment wasn't about recognition. It was about connection. He had shared his journey in a language that everyone could understand, even if they couldn't describe it. And that was enough. Some guests were visibly moved to tears. A few dabbed at their eyes discreetly, while others sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the depth of what they had just experienced. They had come to a formal evening expecting polite entertainment. Instead, they had witnessed a young person pouring his heart into music, showing courage, dedication, and honesty in a way that left no one untouched. The impact was quiet yet profound. A man near the back, who had been one of the most dismissive at the beginning, finally found words. I never thought a simple tune could do this, he said quietly, almost to himself. His friends looked at him, equally awed, realizing that what they had assumed to be simple background music had transformed into something unforgettable. The performer had achieved what few could. He had taken a room full of strangers and made them feel deeply and genuinely without even saying a word. Even the younger guests, who had been chatting and checking their phones at the beginning, now sat entranced. Their eyes were fixed on the performer, their attention completely captured. They had learned something unexpected that evening, that talent, honesty, and persistence could create moments that words and gestures alone never could. The music had reminded them of the power of quiet dedication, of the courage to keep going even when no one seems to notice. The young performer finally lowered his hands from the keys, letting the last vibration of sound fade naturally. There was a brief pause of silence so complete that it almost felt sacred. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath, not wanting to disturb the fragile, beautiful spell that had been created. In that pause, it felt as though time itself had stopped, allowing everyone to fully absorb the depth of what had just happened. Then came the standing ovation. Slowly, one by one, guests rose to their feet. At first, it was a few hesitant claps, but soon the room was filled with enthusiastic applause, cheers, and even some quiet exclamations of admiration. People who had been doubtful, critical, or indifferent at the start were now openly praising the young performer, recognizing not just his skill, but the courage and authenticity behind it. Some of the staff who had been working quietly around the room also paused, watching in awe. They had seen many performers over the years, but few had left such a deep impression. One waiter, who had been serving drinks while sneaking glances at the stage, found himself smiling softly, feeling unexpectedly moved. Another staff member, carrying a tray of glasses, whispered to a colleague, "I've never felt anything like this before." The music had bridged the gap between audience and performer, connecting everyone in a shared moment of emotion. The young performer finally allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He didn't need to make a show of it. He didn't need to seek attention. The applause, the cheers, the admiration, all of it was enough, not because it validated him, but because it reflected the connection he had created through honesty and dedication. He understood now that music wasn't about impressing people, it was about expressing what was inside, letting others feel it, and trusting that it could reach them. Guests slowly began to quiet down, still standing, still moved, still feeling the energy of the moment. Some wiped their eyes, some pressed hands to their chests, others simply took a deep breath, as if trying to capture the feeling before it faded. The room had been transformed, even if only for a few minutes, by something pure and genuine. It had been reminded that real beauty doesn't always come in grand gestures, it can come in small, honest expressions that touch people deeply. A few people approached the performer quietly after the applause had settled. They didn't ask for autographs or photos. They simply said thank you. One whispered, "That guy was incredible. Thank you for sharing this." Another added, "I've never felt anything like that in a long time." And though the performer responded politely, he didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. The music had already said everything he needed to share. Even the most critical audience members were visibly affected. A man who had mocked the idea of a simple tune at the beginning now nodded slowly, acknowledging that he had been wrong. He had underestimated not just the performer's skill, but the power of dedication, humility, and authenticity. The room, once filled with doubt and polite indifference, had been reshaped by the courage of one person who refused to settle for being unnoticed. The young performer finally stepped away from the instrument. He didn't rush to leave. He didn't pause dramatically for applause. He simply moved with quiet dignity, understanding that the experience was shared, not owned. The audience, still captivated, continued to absorb the impact. They had witnessed something rare, a moment that combined skill, honesty, and emotion in a way that left no one untouched. Some guests continued to whisper to each other, trying to process what they had just experienced. "I can't believe how much feeling was in that," one said. "It was just real." "Honest," another replied. They hadn't expected to be moved, to feel such connection, to be reminded of something deeper about life and human effort. Yet there it was, right in front of them, created by a young person who had quietly shared their gift, and in that quiet, human moment, the room collectively understood something important. True talent is not about showing off. True talent is about honesty, perseverance, and the courage to let yourself be seen, even when the world doesn't expect anything from you. The performer hadn't sought approval, and yet he had earned it entirely, not through words or arrogance, but through music and the authenticity behind it. The hall began to settle, the formal event continuing quietly around the powerful moment that had just unfolded. Conversations resumed, but they were softer now, filled with awe and reflection. People glanced at each other, sharing the understanding that they had been part of something rare. They would remember this evening, not for the food, the drinks, or the decor, but for the way one person's honesty and skill had moved an entire room. The young performer left the stage quietly, carrying himself with humility and grace. He didn't need to announce triumph or seek recognition. The music had already spoken. The audience, now seated or lingering, continued to feel the echo of the performance. The simple tune, which had begun as a background request, had become something unforgettable. It had reminded everyone present of the beauty of dedication, the power of honesty, and the unexpected magic that can come from sharing what is real. For the performer, the experience was more than applause or admiration. It was confirmation that persistence, patience, and belief in oneself matter. Even when no one is watching, even when people doubt, even when the world seems indifferent, staying true to your craft can create moments that touch lives in ways you cannot imagine. And tonight, that truth had been proven to everyone in the hall. As people slowly began to leave, still discussing quietly what they had felt, one thing became clear. The memory of this performance would linger far longer than the evening itself. The young performer had given more than music. He had given proof that courage, skill, and honesty could move people beyond expectation, leaving a mark that could never be erased. And in that quiet, human-centered truth, the story ended not with grand words or dramatic gestures, but with the knowledge that authenticity and persistence can create moments that stop a room, touch hearts, and change lives forever.